All right, welcome everyone. Today is the first study group that I've hosted in months, and I apologize for that. It's just, things get busy and then I can't believe how much time passes. So today is June 13th, 2017, and I have an awesome guest that I'm really excited to hear speak. Her name is Stacey Fletcher. She is a dental hygienist from Arkansas, and she's also been trained in myofunctional therapy. And her specialty is the MTHFR genetic mutation. And basically, I met her online, and we have a mutual friend, and she has gone down the rabbit hole of tongue ties, and she knows so much more than I do that I thought, you know what, we've got to get her knowledge out there and shared. So I asked if she would speak and share her wisdom with all of you guys. So let me just go through a brief bio. Basically, you sent it to me, Stacey. I'm going to summarize it, and then you can add in anything else you think that I missed. So it sounds like her journey started in 2013 when she had a really difficult time breastfeeding her son, who was born that year. And he had a posterior tongue tie that went undiagnosed for 2 years. And you guys can imagine how difficult that probably was. So she said, after recovering from postpartum depression, and struggling with that situation, she decided to do something to help other mothers with this issue. So that's when she started to do her myofunctional training. And she's currently also getting certified as an IBCLC lactation specialist. So that's pretty cool. She's taken tons of courses and tons of training, read lots of books on gut health, methylation, tongue-tie, and all those related topics that we're all kind of just starting to figure out. So I'm excited to hear what she has to say. She's really fascinated with breastfeeding. She's taking a baby fascia course this summer, which sounds really cool. And she's also going to follow up with some massage therapy and craniosacral therapy training. So I'm excited to hear her presentation today. I hope you guys were all able to download it and open it. I'm just going to let you take over, Stacey. Are you good to go?
I am. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for being on and speaking with. I should introduce the group to you. So everybody here is a hygienist or a dentist. I think we've got one dentist on, and they are from all over the world, mostly the US. We've got 2 Canadians. I'm hoping that Ruka was able to call in. She's from Singapore. I know she was trying to communicate with me on Facebook. And there's a couple from Australia that I don't know if they're calling in or not. So we'll see. But there's about 50 people, and I don't know how many exactly are on the call right now, but yeah, that's who is listening, and everyone is a hygienist or a dentist, and they've all been trained in myofunctional therapy, so you know your audience.
Awesome.
All right.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. Then take it away.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, I'm glad to be here, and hopefully some of this is new information and will help broaden some perspectives in the world of epigenetics and methylation. So, like she said, this was kind of a personal journey for me, and it became kind of my passion. There's plenty of people I've learned from, and I'm still learning more all the time, but hopefully I can shed some good introductory information on how all of this comes together. So everyone's capable of looking at these slides, obviously. Some of them are just definitions. So those first 2 introductory slides, and then we have that first slide there on epigenetics. This was something that was very, very new to me. A lot of people seem to know what epigenetics is now, but just even a few years ago, this was very foreign to my mind. I was, raised very allopathically and thought that we got sick and we, became diseased creatures because we had bad genetics, right? So thankfully in hygiene school, I learned that it's a lot more complicated than that. And then with myofunctional therapy, I learned even more. So hopefully we all know that most myofunctional presentations, tongue-tie included, is more of an epigenetic presentation. It's what is above the gene. So you can all read that definition. That's one of many out there. That it was introduced in the early 1940s. It was probably theorized long before then. But essentially, it's much more than our genes. So the Human Genome Project presented the knowledge that we're very much more simplistic creatures than we initially thought. And what makes us the great humans that we are and the complicated species that we are is that everything else that we're exposed to and how that affects our genetic expression. So that's pretty much what epigenetics is everything else that lets us express or not express our genetic potential. So on the next slide, like I said, the simplified version is we can't change our DNA itself. Our genetic makeup is what we're given, but we can either express it to the full extent or things happen to where certain things aren't expressed or things are expressed that really should have been turned off in the disease sense. So we can inherit things genetically, but just because we're predisposed to something bad doesn't mean we can't alter ourselves in a way that kind of downplays that bad thing, and we can enhance the more healthy aspects of ourselves. So this is true in, health and disease and so many different things. So we have a lot of control, even if that control is difficult sometimes. So that little side note there is kind of what I just talked about. So the next slide here on 6 is just showing that I'm going to go over some basic definitions you guys are probably well aware of, even if you don't remember them. So we have our mitosis cells and our asexual reproduction. You can kind of read through those. That's not necessarily important to this discussion. And our meiosis, and then again, next we have our definition of DNA. Again, not necessarily super important to this discussion, but just kind of the building blocks of where all of this comes from. So one important thing on that slide 10 here is the single nucleotide polymorphism. So when we're talking about MTHFR, that is one of these SNPs, as they're called. And we have different variations. And I've still learned a little bit more since I put this initial slide together, and that those components, those nucleotides, depending on how they're arranged, are actually what gives us our quote bad expression. So I myself have 2 copies of one of the MTHFR mutations and one of another one. So I'm kind of messed up. That just is one of those things that we learn about ourselves, right? So the SNPs here are kind of how you get into the nitty gritty. It can get really complicated, but essentially they're just these little biomarkers that tell us what's going on. So, no one out there that I know of, unless they're, potentially untouched by our modern life, is going to have these, optimally expressed genomes. Most of us have some degree of these SNPs. Some people, it is MTHFR. Other people, it's the COMP, and other people, it's the VDR. And I'm not going to go into all those details, but just to know that we have multiple different pathways with our methylation cycles, and it can be MTHFR, but it can also be other components that can really impede our body's ability to function properly. And tongue-tie is just one of the physical expressions of what the consequences are to that. So methylation was another big word that kind of turned me into this other path. And it's pretty much the building blocks of everything that controls our cellular function. So all of the mechanisms that go on in our body and everything that's expressed is controlled by this methylation process. There's tons of great resources on methylation, and it can get super complicated. Dr. Amy Yasko was one of the first people that I learned about methylation from. She has some amazing books. Most of them are free right now that you can download off her website. There's a couple of them you can pay for. They're not expensive, but she really delves into details and breaks all of this stuff down much, much more than I could ever go into. But she's really big on helping you figure out these groups in your own body and working with you and your practitioners to kind of get into the root cause and the DNA component of your health or disease. So she's an amazing resource. So this next slide here, number 12, was taken from one of her websites, and it was about the proper functioning of the methylation cycle. So again, all these diseases and this cycle is just as simple as you can have one or two components in this very complicated cycle that can just become less than functional, right? We can have these little SNPs. So instead of our body processing, let's say folic acid, which is synthetic, versus folate, which comes from food, if our system isn't functioning properly, whereas a person who is, it's still going to take multiple steps to break down folic acid, but a functioning methylation system can still accomplish that. Someone like myself who has a less than functional methylation system is going to have a much more complicated time processing that folic acid. And in all reality, they may never get the functioning components of that folic acid in their body, and they may be getting all of these nutrients they think they need, but their body's not recognizing them the right way. So it can be MTHFR, it can be all those other SNPs, and anywhere along these pathways, you can have these little diversions that throw something off. So our next slide here on 13 is again from Dr. Yasser. So that just breaks down some of the things that methylation controls. Detox and immune function are among the most important. Inflammation, things that we know affect, the mouth. We know affect decay and perio and the way our bodies process different things. And then if we're not functioning with methylation, that can eventually, because our system's not functioning properly, turn into those chronic multi-label diseases. So then we have, again, that very complicated, this is kind of what I was talking about with the methylation pathway. So you have all of these pathways. MTHFR C is right there in the middle, and then you have all these other different components. NOS, which I'll get to in a little bit, this is where our important nasal breathing plays in. We make this, we know that, and so we need that in our body. It's super important to do this whole cleanup business. And if we're mouth breathing, look at all the components there on the left-hand side that could be affected because we're simply breathing through our mouth. And then right over here with that MTHFR, these are the DNA components and not processing, not recycling, not being able to get all of these toxic things out of our body the way we should. So on the last slide of this first section, number 15, is kind of my simplified version. And like I already mentioned, methylation runs all the cellular processes in the body. We have to have the right nutrients, vitamins, minerals, all of that in the right form, right? And that may be different for each person. Some people may be able to tolerate methylfolate. Some people can't. Some people need a different form. Everything we come in contact with, externally, internally, what we put in our body, what's in the air, all the different viruses we come in contact with, all the stresses, they all affect our methylation process. And some people can handle those and be resilient, and other people with multiple SNPs just aren't going to process their environment the way a healthy person would. And eventually that takes a big toll on their body. So you can kind of delve into that a little bit deeper and read through those. So now we have, I put that next slide in here again, because originally I broke this up into 3 different presentations. So again, you have that methylation pathway. It's the same one as before. But I'm going to break down these pathways a little bit more. They're not super important to our tongue-tie topic, but it just kind of gives you that breakdown that it's a lot more complicated than just the MTHFR gene. So we have, all these different cycles. I'm not going to go into those in details. You're perfectly capable of reading through those. Homocysteine levels, though, is one of those things and it's a huge marker for compromised methylation function. People with high homocysteine are going to be those chronically ill people, even if it's subclinical. I have a theory that a lot of our chronic perio patients probably suffer from some high homocysteine. Anyway, so just kind of going into those cycles, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on those because they're not super relevant, but this folate cycle is really important. So especially when we're talking about MTHFR, many people don't know that folic acid itself is synthetic. Folate is extremely important in DNA synthesis, which controls, everything, right? Amino acid metabolism and the generation of methyl groups. So essentially those three things run most all processes in our body. There's certainly many, many other things that go on, but those are really important and are what we have found, at least in theory, to be connected to MTHFR more directly. So anyone who doesn't know what MTHFR is, it has it right here. It's methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. That's the big fancy name for it. It's extremely important in processing the folate metabolism. Again, there's that homocysteine and that methithione conversion. All of our B vitamins are important. So what most people don't realize is when we eat a standard American diet, a lot of processed foods that might be enriched, a lot of those vitamins are synthetic, and some people can process those just fine, others cannot. And so you'll actually be in a state of kind of chronic vitamin deficiency, even though you may be intaking a multitude of different types of vitamins. So many, preconceptive and pregnant women are told to take folic acid. Well, if you're one of those people with MTHFR, you may not be processing that. And there's some theory that says if you take folic acid and you have MTHFR and it's expressing, you can actually be doing more damage because you're blocking any folate you get from the diet. I don't know of anything definitive that's been proven, but there is a lot of theory that supports that. So hopefully one day we'll know a little bit more.
Stacey, I have a question for you then. What is the best recommendation? I mean, knowing this, what would you recommend that pregnant women do? If they should take, the vitamin B supplements, or should they not, or should they get tested first, or what do you tell people? In a
perfect world, we'd be looking at these things, including their, whether or not they're mouth breathing and their myofunctional status, and their apnea status, in addition to their genetic status, right? We would look at all of these before they even conceived, because as we know from oral development, the tongue develops really early on, right? And we don't know which stage of that process. Is it set at conception? Does it happen because of lack of apoptosis later on? There's lots of different theories as to why this frenum remnant exists, right? But I think the only really good way to have an impact on whether or not a tongue-tie is expressed or any other epigenetic issue is to know before you even conceive. There's theory that, it can take 2 or 3 years to fix our body and get it to a point where maybe we can have a big impact on whether or not these things express. So knowing the genetic status and then helping optimize it before conception would be ideal. But if you're pregnant, whereas in my case, I couldn't really take methylfolate. It really didn't sit well with me. But most people would recommend a methylfolate supplement. There's Thorne vitamins and others out there for a pregnant mother to take. It's not going to reverse their risk of a tongue-tie. We have yet to prove anything like that. But in theory, it can help at least give you a little bit of a stepping stone in battling some of those potential expressions if you have a methylated vitamin. And usually it's much more complicated than that, and we need to be looking at their, their gut health and their actual nutritional status, like with an oat test and, checking for leaky gut and getting them nasal breathing and all of those things that really should be addressed before conception, but a lot of it can be worked on during pregnancy to at least optimize their infant's outcome. So yeah, I don't think there's any simple answers, and maybe one day, doctors will screen for these things when women, some of them are now when women are struggling to conceive, but unfortunately, most relatively healthy moms, unless they already know these things, they're not looking for these things. So, but again, there's Dr. Amy Yasko's page. She's big on the nutrigenomics, which is all about how the nutrition interacts with our genes. It's just another component of the epigenetics, and is more on the front of how we get out of this mess. Nutrigenomics is something that would ideally be given to every mother before they even conceive. So here's another person that I've gotten some great information from, Dr. Bob Miller. He, some people know him as Dr. DNA. He has a really good website that has some great information. He's a lot more supplement-based, but Dr. Yasko is too. Supplements are very important in a lot of these processes, but so are foods, and that's a whole nother discussion. But so this is kind of where, here on slide number 22, is my take on why it's so complicated of a topic, right? So we're dealing with methylation damage. So, generations ago, when our ancestors weren't exposed to, industrial issues, and even with myofunctional issues, there's plenty of doctors that have researched the beginning of the agricultural revolution and how it impacted the way our faces grow. Dr. Kevin Boyd's one of them, and plenty of others out there. But, when we look at anthropology, we can kind of see how we've developed into these much more sick creatures. And there's lots of different things we come into contact with that impact that. So to really get a handle on it, you kind of have to take a step back and see, like, how did we get here? How long have we been creating this problem? And that kind of gives us an idea of how hard it is to change. I'm sure everyone knows of Dr. Barry Raphael, and one thing he talks about is Pottinger's cat, and how, it can take several generations to start seeing these offspring that actually can't survive because they're so far detached genetically from what they're supposed to be, and that it can take that many generations again to fix those problems. So, we're not defective cats, but it's just interesting to see how, we can get so far removed from our genetic potential that it may take several generations of actively working on these issues before we really see a change. So that's where, I have in here that it's much more than MTHFR. MTHFR is an amazing stepping stone. There's been wonderful headway made in learning about MTHFR and how it relates to tongue-tie and all of that. But I think even just our oxidative stress and whether or not we, our mothers nasal breathe during pregnancy, everything we're exposed to in utero affects our genetic potential long term. So we were talking about methylation and why it was important. Literally, it controls everything, and so much of our, chronic disease presentation, so many people are on medications for chronic illnesses, and a lot of it boils down to different presentations of methylation dysfunction. And it's going to be literally different for every person as to how it can be addressed. But hopefully one day we'll have, many more physicians that look at disease from this aspect. Many functional medicine doctors do, but hopefully this will become much more common knowledge one day. That next slide here on 29 is some genes and what they do. You can obviously read through there. That's what I was talking about all these other genes and their expression. There can be mutations of many of these, and any of them can affect our genetic expression. So this is one thing I hear all of the time when I'm talking to people, things that I've heard myself, that, you're fine. You're not dying, so you're fine. So many people have chronic disease, and just because we're functional and we can make it through our day-to-day, it doesn't mean we're fine. It just means we're okay. We're not dead. We're not bedridden, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're functioning optimally. We see this all the time in our myofunctional clients, right? They may think they're okay, but we can see they're having issues that maybe are, just affecting their orthodontic care, or maybe is really taking a toll on their overall health. And their general dentist might have said, hey, that tongue thrust is fine, or that tongue tie is fine, but we know different. So it's just kind of looking through that different lens as to what fine means in that specific situation. So a lot of people say that, that absence of disease is fine, but just because we're not visibly sick doesn't mean we are in perfect health, right? We're onions, we're puzzle pieces. We need to break apart these different components. And, potentially if someone comes in with a tongue tie, maybe they have some of these things going on. Now, are we the right person to address that? Of course not. I'm not a functional medicine doctor. I'm in no way qualified to treat these issues. But if you have a patient come in with a serious tongue tie and all this, myofunctional issue going on, and you see that they're on 20 medications and they have apnea, it might be good to find a few competent doctors in your region and chat with them and kind of share this information and be like, hey, this might be something that would be another potential collaborator when you see all these things, that they might have some of these things going on underneath the surface. So my last little section here, does anyone have any questions up to this point? I know it's been a really sciencey and possibly a little boring on the science aspect. It can get a little heavy.
No, I think it's great. Stacey, I do have a question for you, and
Yeah.
We'll see if anybody else does, but I'm curious. So if you see a patient who's tongue-tied, do you instantly kind of go to, in your mind at least, maybe you don't say it to the patient, what other expressions of that, I'm not even sure if I'm saying it right, that genetic mutation, could they potentially be struggling with? Do you find that with, like, the tongue tie is like the canary in the coal mine of symptoms?
Right.
Like, could they have like other autoimmune disorders and things like that?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna talk to them about that at the consult, right? Because they're probably gonna run out the door thinking I'm the crazy witch doctor on the corner. But yeah, it's something that, especially if they're presenting and the kid has several food allergies, they have asthma, they have eczema, they have all these things that we've now figured out are tied to leaky gut. They have autoimmune disorders, or, thyroid disease, or even high blood pressure, which could certainly just be because they're mouth breathing, or could it be from high homocysteine? So it's just things that I just check off in the back of my head. And some people you can just look at and you just know, like, this isn't really a well person, right? And it's just something I think about. So, they're there to see me for myofunctional health. But if it's something that I really notice is, I know that I can get them in touch with someone that might be able to help them throughout their visits. I just kind of gauge, where are they? I'm not going to tell them they have a methylation disorder, but if I can kind of, work through that process, are they a person that's open to, I hate the term alternative medicine or, things like that. But if they're open to that concept, it's good to have that person in your pocket that you can be like, hey, just like we would a chiropractor, right? Might be good for you to go see this person, maybe not, maybe they can help you. But
And have you been able to successfully kind of build up a network of those people around you?
Yeah, we don't have a lot of that locally in my area. Our closest functional medicine doctor is about 2.5 hours away. And so a lot of my people, the first thing I'll do is be like, if I gauge they're open to the concept first, I'll kind of point them to Dr. Yasko's information or Dr. Lynch's information. If they know what MTHFR is, I'll kind of just give them some resources that they can.
Well, that's something we can all probably do too then.
Yeah.
If they're interested, some people are, they want to learn all about all about their health if they can. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the patients who aren't that interested and the ones that really are. So, but yeah, sending them to those websites, I think that's something we could all do. So
yeah, perfect. For sure. And I made my mistake of, mentioning it to the wrong person and they're like, no, but just like that person who's never going to go to a chiropractor, like they just think that it's, this hooky medicine or something that, so there's going to be those people that have absolutely no interest in caring about, their genetic underlying issues and they want to take their medications and that's fine. But there's going to be those other people that, they want to know more. And so, whereas I can't help them directly, it's just good to be able to identify those things and maybe point them in a self-help direction. Whereas even if we don't have someone locally, there's lots of these providers that work, via Skype and things like that, that can help them if they're inclined to pursue that, right? So I just try to be a resource for those people. So I think this is one of my favorite slides here, number 32, which is in my final little section here. The old adage, we've all heard, you are what you eat, right? But it's so much more important now that we're exposed to so many things through our food and our water. Anthropologically speaking, again, we weren't meant to carry, all of these burdens around with us, right? We weren't exposed to all of these heavy chemicals. Now, there's so many things that are better today with our modern society and our healthcare than we could have ever imagined back then, right? But unfortunately, certain things that are on our food and in our food and how our food is processed, the fact that we don't chew as much, we prepare our food in different ways, that our water is loaded with toxic things. We put stuff on our skin that, we were never probably meant to be exposed to. Even our night-day, stuff it can get so complicated, and there's so many experts out there that know so much more about this than me. But, how much sunlight we get, and, if we watch TV after dark, just things that we take for granted, really, in our society that we would never think actually impact the way our bodies function. If we look ancestrally, so many things we do different that our bodies just have not adapted to. Now, they've adapted to the point where we survive these things, but they've not necessarily adapted to where we can be optimal in these types of environments, right? So it's just something to keep in mind. And, no one's going to ask anyone to go back to the dark ages, myself included, but it's just things we can be more aware of that we can impact in our own lives, really simple things that we can do that can really have a big benefit. So the next slide there on 33 talks about that. This was a very overwhelming idea for me, that how much stress we're exposed to. And I mean, even things like Wi-Fi and how we sleep and, when we go to bed and all these things that, I'm not going to change my entire life, but I can take baby steps. And some patients can have, miraculous changes in their health just by learning to breathe and to handle their stress and become more adaptive and, turning the TV off when it's night out. Simple things that we really wouldn't think affect us, but on a cellular level really can. I went through a really big time of it being a very overwhelming process. So I've been there. I understand it. So our food, again, it should be what sustains us, what nourishes us physically in every way. Our food should be a safe haven to our bodies. And so many times it's not. And what we put in our body directly affects our cellular functioning. There's no perfect diet for everyone. Most people need to be, on I hate the word diet anyway, by the way, but a food, plan or whatever you want to call it, that's more customized to their genetic component. I can't eat folic acid. Someone without MTHFR mutation may not have to be that strict with folic acid. I have to be very careful with the synthetic vitamins I eat. So that makes my food choices much more complicated. So again, our food supply, how it's processed, and this can get very political, so I'm not going to go into all of that. But, just things that if you're inclined to know more about and how they affect our body, some people, again, are going to be just fine with these things, and others have to be extremely strict. So again, what I just mentioned, eat for your genes. There's plenty of people out there who should probably be avoiding gluten, but then again, there may be some that are fine with it. Some people can tolerate organic wheat, whereas others really can't have any. Some people are going to be able to tolerate milk, whereas many people really shouldn't have any. Fermented foods, have always been touted as an amazing source of pre and probiotics, but there are those people out there with histamine issues because of their mutations that may not tolerate those foods. So many things, and we see this in dentistry even. There's people that, present with horrible diets with no issues, right? And there's people that present with super healthy diets that get decay all the time. And we know that it's how we respond to that bacteria, right? So I've put some good guidelines to follow. This is just kind of what I've found in my research that are, ideal and nothing set in stone, but these are things that have kind of worked for me. Being careful with your genetics, hopefully learning what your body can tolerate and what it can't, listening to your body, whole unprocessed foods as much as we can, right? It's almost impossible to eat perfectly in our society today. But, as organic as you can, as unprocessed as you can, avoiding things that are heavily refined. All of these things are going to affect how your genes express. And for some people, it's going to be much more detrimental than others. And again, the most important thing here is something I took a long time to learn is not just stress about it, right? Stress is extremely damaging to our body. So the most important thing we can do is eat healthy. But even on top of that, we shouldn't stress about it. We have to live our life, right? We have to be human. So doing the best we can in each situation. Again, our water, us being dental, I'm quite controversial on this topic, but anyone and everyone can read up on their, beliefs on fluoride. I'm not going to get into that, but, some people, again, are going to be totally fine. And then other people are going to have a much more difficult time processing that. So number 39 here, I kind of already talked on this, what we put on our body.
Hey, Stacey.
Yes, ma'am.
I've got a question for you, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm wondering, can you tell us some of the, what would people notice in their bodies? What would signs or symptoms be that people are struggling with maybe some of these food issues or,
yeah, for sure.
Some of those things that we might be able to pick up on? What do you see?
So what I see a lot, because I'm looking at babies, right? But all of this carries over into children and adolescents and adults. So many things that we have become to believe are common childhood things are not, they're normal now, but they're not normal. They've never been normal. So signs of leaky gut, which is kind of what you're looking for, and that's a great way to learn more about it, is start with leaky gut. Like, start with what it is, how it develops, and what are the signs. But for most people, it is, skin issues. So chronic acne, especially cystic, eczema, a history of eczema, a history of asthma, a history of chronic seasonal allergies and sinusitis, chronic ear infections. In my opinion, perio is something that we know a lot more about than we used to, right? But from what I've seen is that so many of these patients are perio compromised, and it's because their body can't respond to that bacteria. So anything we're seeing on the outside that's abnormal, respiratorily, those cells come into contact with the outside world, right? So that's where your respiratory issues come from, any chronic issues, but cradle cap, baby acne, those are all signs of a microbiome imbalance in the mother that's been passed on to the baby. So if the baby and the mother aren't treated early on, and they optimize their gut health and can heal it, because that's possible, those issues just progress and continue until that child then has, chronic asthma and, allergies all the year, and so on and so forth, eczema. So many things that we feel are so normal in our society are just so common. We've become to think of them as normal. So, how many of your patients have asthma, right? It's everywhere. So, again, some people aren't going to be open to that, but there's so many issues, even chronic anxiety, because, most of our mental capacity is in our gut, right? And when our gut's not healthy, eventually our brain's not going to be healthy. Chronic tonsillar inflammation can be a sign. Hyperactivity in kids. We know that how that's linked to mouth breathing, right?
But and it can sleep apnea. So it's like everything is all connected.
Right. And that's exactly it. And, it may not be that all of those patients have leaky gut, but in our society, seriously, so many people do, that it's just rampant, and we've just become so accustomed to it that we just don't even pay attention to it anymore.
What's your definition? Like, how do you describe leaky gut in like a simple way to like a patient who's never heard of it? Or what's your definition?
Yeah. So usually what I'll tell a patient, and kind of probably what was told to me at one point, is that, our gut is supposed to be, I usually use my hands. So not being able to see anyone, right? I talk with my hands. So it's like this interlaced, it's like a puzzle, right? So these interlaced puzzle pieces, and they're not supposed to be tight. They're not supposed to be sewn up, because things have to pass through them, right? We have to pass nutrients and everything, or we would never absorb and we would die. So it has to be semi-permeable in some degree. But when we expose that already vulnerable membrane to, let's say, glyphosate, which is Roundup that's sprayed on, 90% of our crops. So let's say we expose our body to that. Well, it causes these junctions to kind of become weak. And instead of a puzzle piece, it's like the puzzle got wet. And so now it doesn't fit together very well. So things can escape a lot more readily from that puzzle than they could when the puzzle was nice and tight. So when those things get out into the bloodstream, let's say, me, I was raised on a crap diet. My parents didn't know any better. It was normal. So I ate all this crap food when I grew up, and I had, I was formula fed, and I had all these chronic issues I've mentioned. So then I have a child, and my microbiome, the bacteria that I've had my whole life, that's been through everything I've been through, antibiotics, which has killed some off, and all of that. So I give that exact microbiome to my child. And unless I knew how to repair my leaky gut and repair those loose puzzle pieces, then they get all the stuff that I got, right? So that's why we see this in babies. But essentially, these things escape, let's say wheat particles, escape through our now compromised gut, and then our body can react to it like a foreign substance, right? So like it would a bacteria, it can react to these food particles that it should have never reacted to begin with. So, I mean, wheat's a complicated topic. It's one of the most heavily sprayed crops out there. So that can be a multifactorial issue, right? But a lot of these kids, what my mentor, Jennifer Tao, told me that she kind of talks about is that when we see people with multiple allergies, it's not that they're allergic to all those things. I mean, in that moment they are. But when you're allergic to everything, it means that your body is so compromised that it can't be resilient to anything, right? So you can switch your diet. And this is what a lot of people do. So, okay, I'm removing gluten, I'm removing soy, I'm removing dairy, I'm removing corn. But if they don't take steps to heal and nourish the gut lining, which is an entirely different concept and topic, it can get very complicated. But essentially eating, replacing those with good, healthy food, and there's herbs and supplements out there that can help with that, but helping to de-inflame that lining and to help it heal, a lot of those people can then add back in certain foods. Now, they may not be able to add back in the top allergens. That's not probably ideal. But whereas they might have been reacting to strawberries before, now they take all those heavy allergens out, heal their gut, then they might be able to add in those healthy foods that they were reacting to already. So it's, that puzzle piece again, that if it allows all these bad things through, you're going to react to pretty much everything. And there's a spectrum of people. But, if you have a kid that has a history of eczema, chances are they probably have a leaky gut. Our skin's our biggest organ, right? So that's
so fascinating.
Very telling.
Yeah, thank you for sharing
telling.
that.
Yeah, no
helped,
problem.
I think it helped me at least, but hopefully helped other people. And it is a really good way to envision it and explain it to other people. So thank you so much.
Oh yeah, no problem. So I think I'm on slide 40 now, and this is kind of where we get more into our forte of topics, is how we breathe, right? As myofunctional therapists, we know how important it is to breathe properly, to breathe the right way, to breathe the right amount. Obviously, the quality of air we breathe is also very important, but in most cases is less of a controlling factor, because we can't control it, than how we breathe, right? So we know that Buteyko is so important in controlling that breath. Plenty of the stuff we do as just myofunctional therapists, even without Buteyko training, can be very beneficial. We know we're meant to breathe through our mouths and not our nose, or breathe through our noses and not our mouths. But, and I'm sure plenty of us know that long face growth, malocclusion, chronic tonsillar inflammation, the allergies, the asthma, and even potentially hyperactivity, and again, sleep apnea. We've now got good research to link mouth breathing to all those things. So, and again, I was going to take this slide out on number 41 because it's quite controversial to most people, but again, take what you want and leave the rest behind is my motto. So everyone has a myriad of topics on these issues, but if I leave anyone with anything, it's just to be more open-minded. We, in dentistry, there's certain things we become accustomed to, and I was this way myself. I never understood why anyone would forego a fluoride treatment, right? Until I was one of those people that reacted to fluoride. So it's one of those things that I think it's an extremely complicated and controversial topic, among many others, and just being more open-minded and knowing that we don't necessarily have to agree with our patients or our clients, but just being open to where they are in their journey, and that most of them got where they were with the information they have for a reason, and that we don't always have to be on the same page, but just being open to our patients and where they are in their journey, I think is really, really important. Things I've learned about in the healing journey of my own, is how, damaging, how life-saving, but also when it's overdone, how damaging antibiotics can be to the general population, that they were originally used in cows to make them gain weight, right? Here we go. So it's, they're life-saving and absolutely amazing in the right circumstance, but when we overuse them, the disastrous consequence it can have on our microbiome, and that there are so many other things we can do if we learn about them and using them in the right way, like homeopathy, which in other countries is touted as a valid resource, but here not so much. Bach flowers, again, using food in a medicinal way, just learning things that may be out of our comfort zone, that when we learn about their true medicinal value can actually take the place of some of these things that we can reserve for when we really need them. So that's my soapbox on that. But another important thing that myself included really didn't understand the implication of was our mental state, how we react to stress, how we see ourselves in our bodies and in our world, the thoughts that we think and how they impact our methylation cycles. Even if we're a, negative Nancy kind of person, that can literally affect the way, our body handles things. Guilt that we carry around, things like that. There's plenty of ways out there to handle this, things that I've done myself, thankfully, over the years that have made a world of difference in how I process my environment. So number 43 here talks about visual stimulation. I kind of already mentioned this. The importance of our outside light versus some of the detrimental effects that our blue light. I don't know if anyone's familiar with reading about blue light and how that can disrupt our sleeping and waking cycles. There's some theory and, how that can even be potentially linked to sleep apnea because our cycles just get mixed up, and especially combine that with not breathing, and you've kind of got a perfect storm for a body that doesn't function very well. We all know this part. This was something I put in here for some non-dental folk, but even some therapists may not know it, and our traditionally speaking manner, especially if you don't have breastfeeding experience, is traditionally babies went from, strictly breastfeeding, that's all that they knew, to eating solids. Most were given, bones and things to chew on even around 4 to 6 months of age. They didn't have purees and NutriBullets and, even spoons for the most part. Certainly didn't have pacifiers. Things that have just become common practice in our society have kind of put off some of these primitive reflexes to develop properly. Diane Barr has a great book that kind of goes into, how some of these things can be used in a therapeutic way versus how they can be detrimental. Kevin Boyd, again, as I mentioned earlier, is another amazing resource on chewing and how important that is. So baby-led weaning is a good thing to research if you are looking at getting more into infancy. But even then, our infants don't eat tough meat and fibrous vegetables. Most of us as adults don't even do that enough. But having that, flexible tongue is also important in being able to chew those foods, right? Normal full-term breastfeeding is 4+ years of age in most parts of the world. And we're lucky in this country if moms make it to 6 months. There's plenty, outside that as an exception, myself included. We went to a little over 3 years, but the general population, that's not the case. And even if you're not interested in learning about infants or treating infants, just kind of knowing that in the rest of the world, 3 and 4 years of age is the actual norm for breastfeeding. Not exclusively, of course, but as a supplement after, 9 to 12 months of age for their diet. So here's my tie up here, pun intended, on MTHFR and tongue-tie. And so, many people think, and misconception might be a harsh word here, but we hear about MTHFR causing tongue-tie, right? And it might, we just don't know enough about it. But basically, Jennifer and Ben Lynch, and I'm sure plenty of others, kind of found these connections between, okay, these moms have MTHFR, the babies probably do too, and then all these babies are tongue-tied, right? So when they looked at their case studies further, what they were really finding is that most of these babies with these dysfunctional tongues, their mothers also had a significantly compromised microbiome, right? They didn't have the diverse gut flora that they needed to have to be, optimal people. They had these leaky gut presentations. Their babies were sick. They had the eczema, the chronic ear infections, the colic, all of these things, which eventually just continue into other issues as we age. So there's no A plus B equals C formula that we know of that can say, okay, mom, baby number 1 was tongue-tied. What are you going to do about it? Right? And plenty of mothers will say, okay, well, I'm going to take methylfolate and that's going to prevent my baby's tongue-tie. So the whole reason I wanted to touch on the fact that, MTHFR may cause tongue-tie. We don't know enough about it yet, but it's certainly implicated in it. But it's just not as simple as telling a mom, take your methylfolate and baby number 2 or 3 isn't going to have a tongue-tie. We don't even know that if that mother went through 2 years of gut healing and, with no exception, and had the best diet in the world and the best supplements, and, we don't know if that can truly prevent a tongue-tie, because in my theory, and this is nothing more than a theory, but I look back at, Dr. Raphael Pottinger's cats, and I think, how long did it take us to get to where we're seeing so many people with tongue-tie, right? How long is it going to take me as a mother, if I have a daughter or even a son, and I fix their leaky gut, and they have children, is it going to matter? If they live their life a perfect way, right? Which, how is that possible? But if they do, can it affect their offspring or the next generation? I think we're fighting so many onslaughts of things in our society and our environment that it's really hard to say, can we really prevent this issue? And it'd be nice if we really can. And I think it's certainly worth the effort because it can affect so many other things. But I think we just have to be careful. Whereas we want to recognize these things, we also don't want to put false hope in some of these mothers that say, oh, yeah, we can prevent baby number 2 from having a tongue-tie, right? So that's my whole spiel on being careful with preventive measures. So, yeah, I think it's just really important that we can help people identify, if they're interested, maybe pointing them in some directions that might help them, and then just also being optimally cautious of where we stand, because we don't want to misguide anyone, for sure. So like I said earlier, take what works for you and leave the rest behind. Plenty of the stuff I have is probably controversial and political, but it's just my story, right? Where I come from and what I've learned, and everyone is going to have a different aspect here. So as Hillary Scott says, we all have our own story, and they are all important. What's important to me and what's important to you are going to be different things, and respecting each other's journey and learning as we go, I think, is the best thing we can do for each other and for our clients. So
yeah, that's awesome. I really appreciate it. I think that's such great stuff, and some of it I've never heard before. So I'd love to open up to some questions from the group, if you're willing. I know it sounds like your son wants you to go. Hopefully we can take like 10 minutes or so. Would that be okay for people to ask you some questions?
For sure.
Okay, awesome. And also, I would like to hear a little bit more about your story, if you'd want to share it. But let's just see if anyone has some questions first. Anyone out there? Hi, Ruka.
Hi, this is Ruka. Yeah. Thank you. You were saying that you couldn't take folic acid. Can you share, how did you know that you couldn't take it? What were the reactions that you experienced? And over here in Singapore, I'm in Malaysia now, but in Singapore, it's almost like an auto prescription for pregnant moms. So the doctors will prescribe the folic acid pills. So how do you know that you are not suitable for it? And maybe if people ask you what are substitutes that you can recommend to patients?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Yes, thank you. So I took folic acid before I got pregnant with my son. I was on birth control like most people, and took my folic acid and took it in my prenatal. And number one, looking back, that was probably a sign that I was having issue, is I took my folic acid in my multivitamin before I went to bed, and every morning I woke up and threw up. So that was probably my body saying, something's not right here, but I never put two and two together. I just thought, I'm pregnant, you throw up, right? So it wasn't until my son was a year and a half, maybe almost two, probably closer to a year and a half. Anyway, I had just heard about this MTHFR thing. I didn't know much about it. I'd read about it, and it just kept popping up. And I had a few other health problems that I thought might be related. So I talked to my nurse practitioner, and she tested me. Sure enough, it was there. So then I took it upon myself to do the 23andMe test, and found out some other issues that I had. So if you read up on MTHFR, especially Dr. Ben Lynch's website, it's mthfr.net, he talks about why folic acid isn't good for people with MTHFR mutation. Now, they've estimated, and I have no idea where these numbers come from, but they've estimated that 40 to 50% of the population potentially has at least one of many MTHFR mutations. So is that going to affect 40% of the population? Probably not, but it could. So when we take folic acid, it's synthetic and requires about 12 steps to be usable in the body. When we acquire folate from leafy greens, it only takes a few steps to be the same degree of use in the body. So there's other forms of folate. Methylfolate is the most process that is, in theory, closest to being able to use in our body. So when our body takes in folic acid, we have to methylate it to get it through that process. So if we're not methylating, we have no methylating groups to get it through. So it's a big chemistry lesson. But essentially, it's many, many more steps for folic acid to be usable. And in an MTHFR person, it may never get through those processes, right? So if we take folate, because we may never get enough from food, most of us don't eat enough leafy greens and other folate-laden foods. I'm sure there's plenty of people who could do that. But if we're looking at supplementation, it depends on the person. I tried methylfolate because I read about it. I thought, hey, I'm just going to take this methylfolate and my life will be better. But it really wasn't that simple. I took it for 2 weeks. I felt amazing. And then all of a sudden I had this massive bout of anxiety, and it was horrible. It's absolutely horrible. So then I read, oh, hey, that can happen in some people. So I realized, well, I shouldn't take folic acid because I have this MTHFR issue. And me personally, I'm significantly compromised. I have three of these SNPs that are really bad, whereas someone with one may do better on it. I don't know. So folinic acid and folate. And then for some people, methylfolate. You asked for alternatives. Those are all alternatives. Seeking Health is a brand, and Thorne are brands that have methylated folate prenatals. You can buy folinic acid and other things by themselves. I caution anyone, though, whereas I made my mistakes, is a lot of things need to be addressed in a certain order. So what I did to myself was I took methylfolate and I had a lot of other issues going on I didn't know about, and that's why it made me worse. Other people might be fine, but to use, because it's extremely important to get folate when we're pregnant, right? That is very important. So just telling someone not to take folic acid is ill-advised, but giving them an alternative, especially if you know they're compromised, might be ideal. Now, are we allowed to do that depending on your state and your country? Maybe, maybe not. You know, I'm in a lot of mom groups, and it's something we discuss. You know, my doctor told me to take folic acid. Hey, here's a link. Maybe you should reconsider that and look up this information on your own, and here's some good talking points with your physician and see if maybe they'd consider these alternatives, and this is why. So that's kind of the perspective I take, is letting the client put the ball in their court and giving them links that they can take to their prescribed, make a better decision. Did that help?
That sounds that's a great description. I had that question too, Ruka. I'm also wondering, for adults, I know that there are several tongue-tied hygienists in all of our groups, especially the current group that I'm working with right now. There's at least 3. So if you're an adult and you're tongue-tied, and you've gone through this personally, I haven't. I can't relate to the experience, but I have other myofunctional issues that I've dealt with. But what would you recommend for adults? You know, of course, having the frenum release, doing the myofunctional exercises. What do you say to your adult patients or clients?
So when I'm seeing a client in the office, obviously they're not there to see me about gut health and methylation. So kind of like we talked before, I kind of feel them out. If it's, you know, a fairly healthy person, you know, we go over, you know, what I feel are the normal protocols, the myofunctional therapy, the body work, the pre and post care, and how important that habituation is to their long-term success. But in some people, if you have an adult and they have an autoimmune issue, or they have, you know, a thyroid issue, or just things that are, you know, you're seeing in their medical history that might be concerning, those are the people that, you know, I might mention, hey, you know, do you know what leaky gut is? You know, I can get you some resources, because unfortunately, if we have someone with leaky gut, they're probably nutritionally compromised in some way, right? They're not absorbing nutrients right. And so I'm in some holistic groups, and some of these moms have went through this process, and, you know, they're the ones that reattach really quickly, and that don't get the optimal outcome. And what these moms, more than anything, the moms themselves are figuring out is that, you know, they had a release when they were in the throes of this bad gut issue or this nutritional deficiency issue. Because what do we need to grow new collagen, right? We need nutrients to grow anything. And so if you have a leaky gut and some nutritional deficiencies, cutting into that tissue at that moment in time, you know, it may be necessary. If they're apneic, you know, what's more important, breathing and having a better frenum than you have today? Of course. But if you have the opportunity and the patient is willing, and, you know, addressing inflammation in the body is super important around a tongue-tie release. And, you know, if that patient has celiac and doesn't know it, you know, if they're chronically inflamed and, you know, they have bowel distress and IBS and some of these things they may not mention to you necessarily, but if they have distress and inflammation in the body, how do you think that surgical site's going to heal, right? So those are just things that when I'm talking about healing in my patients, and especially in my babies, but even in my adults, if you're inflamed, you know, if they have joint pain all the time, you know, they're probably inflamed. And, you know, some people are just not going to care. They're not going to go off of their, you know, grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch. It's just not going to happen. But there are others that if you give them just that tidbit of information, like, okay, we need to do this release, I'm seeing XYZ in your medical history that might make your, result less than optimal, would you consider seeing whoever or learning about whatever that might make your, we may put off the revision for a couple months, but it might make your result much different on the back end, right?
All right. Well, Stacey, how can people get a hold of you? Are you okay with people reaching out if they have individual questions?
Yeah,
do you want to direct them to a Facebook page, a website, your email address? Why don't you give them some information?
Yeah. So if anyone's not already aware, they may already be on it, but I do run a professional support group or a professional info sharing for Myofunctional, and I will occasionally share, some epigenetic and methylation stuff on there. So I do the Myofunctional RDH page on Facebook. So anyone can reach me there. I'm on Facebook, Stacey Fletcher, and my business email is rdhsfletcher@gmail. Those are probably the best ways to reach me, is either Facebook or email. I don't have a business website yet. I'm working on that, so I don't have that up and ready just yet. But the Facebook page or my email are usually the quickest way to get a hold of me. So
awesome. Well, I really appreciate your time and all this valuable information. I mean, I learned a lot today, so I might even have questions for you later. But
sure.
I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge. So
I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, we will be in touch. Thanks a lot. I hope everyone has a great night. And you guys can email me if you need help finding Stacey, or you can email her directly or find her on Facebook, join her group. And I hope you all have a wonderful night. And that's it. We'll wrap things up and call it a night.
All right, everyone have a good night.
All right, thanks, Stacey. Bye.